right. Well, welcome to the episode 1 of Across the Pod Wargamers. This is a podcast that is dedicated to all things wargaming, probably with more of a historical slant than anything, but we'll see how that develops. My name's Gary. On the line with me is Colin, and we'll be your hosts for this podcast. The purpose behind this podcast is to promote the hobby, to try and share new things with folks, and kind of get the ideas discussing or begin discussing new ideas, or various ideas across the hobby. And if we can help promote the hobby and grow it in any way, then fantastic. Going into introduction, just to let you know who you're talking to or listening to. My name's Gary. I am an old git, approaching 60 or in 60. I have been gaming since about 9 years old. My day job has me as a managing teams and consultants on a global level, but hobby-wise, it's never enough time for the hobby. I'm primarily historical wargaming. I like both skirmish and battle gaming. I do dabble a little bit in some science fiction, but not nearly as much as historical. I started off in the hobby. My first introduction to the hobby as a theory or process was actually down in the basement of my grandparents' house over in Germany, where my grandfather would walk me through on a little table he had downstairs. We're using markers and wood blocks, walk me through various battles in history. Some of them were World War II, some of them were Spanish Civil War, some of them were other periods. When I turned 9, I fell into a group of gamers in the area of Muskegon, Michigan, and was a young punk hanging out on the fringes of these older guys who were all running these games. The very first set of wargaming rules I ever bought was a set of rules called Tractics. So that right there will date how old I am. Other than that, that's my background in a nutshell. Colin, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hello, folks. My name's Colin. Of course, Gary's son. I'm only 25 years old, so towards the younger generation of this hobby, it seems, but still definitely into it, especially the historical side. Very rarely do I go into science fiction or fantasy, but I'm mostly a family man. I work for the United States military, but my real starting hobby came from Gary, of course. I started me out very, very young. It was mostly modeling and building figures, maybe playing with some Space Marines that he bought some time ago. I believe they're 90s models or maybe potentially late 80s. You'll have to get with him on that. But yeah, it all started out with I don't even know how young I was. It was about year 2000, and I'm 25 now, so about 5 years old, I guess. There was a barn, and we had a model railroad set in the barn, and it was a huge set. And Gary built this beautiful table, and there was also this mountain where the train could go underneath it into a tunnel, and that was the coolest thing. But he started giving me figures from, of course, Space Marines, Tyranids, and the Lord of the Rings, because I was very into Lord of the Rings at that young age. But we moved from Stratford upon Avon to a place called Colbrookdale, kind of that general area in the West Midlands, and we started going to the Telford War Games Club. And I think it was the first historical game. It was Napoleonics, and myself and him were on the edges of the battlefield playing skirmishers, and we both shot each other up pretty good, but he mostly shot the birds in the trees.
I forgot about that. Yeah, I remember that now.
Yeah, and ever since I've been very into historical wargaming. I like more of the campaign aspect of it, but instead of just fighting one battle, fighting multiple battles, keeping track of your troops, supply, logistics. I guess the military has kind of shaped me that way to see the bigger picture than just every single battle. But I'm very much into historicals because of Gary.
Well, you know what they say, Colin. Amateurs talk tactics, professionals talk logistics.
Yes.
You know that? Do you remember the very first wargaming show we went to was in Shrewsbury when we were living over in England, and we met the Telford War Games Club. They were at the base of a staircase playing a 15 millimeter feudal Japan samurai game.
Oh yes.
Do you remember that? That was the first introduction, and we didn't even know there was a club located close to us because we were south of Telford, and we ran across those guys there. And that's how, once we got that, we were able to start bringing you to the games on nights you didn't have school. So, and those guys really were very nice to Colin and really helped develop. They were very welcoming in that too, even though we did speak funny for those folks. But we'll probably have some of the guys from Telford on this show somewhere down the line. In fact, one of our persons who's scheduled to be a sometimes co-host will be from that club as well. But we'll wait till he's on the show for the first time before we introduce him. So with that, Colin, I'm going to let you go first. What type of activities have you been working on? And, what type of long-term and short-term projects have you got going in the wargaming space?
Well, I guess I'm going to have to break the ground on the recent project we've both undertaken.
Yep.
So right now, currently in boxes and on tables and all over the place are 6 millimeter Napoleonics, mostly Russians. There's quite a bit of them. I've spent the past few months just painting and basing the cavalry. Now I'm about to move on to the Russian infantry. It's going to be a whole lot of green. I'm just dabbing on these figures with red trim, yellow trim, white trim, and of course the gold lace across the kaiver. Excuse me if I'm saying it incorrectly. Russian's not my forte in languages. It's mostly that.
I struggle with English, so go ahead.
Yeah, I tend to go towards the more rural side of U.S. English. So if anybody from the United Kingdom and Europe's currently listening to this, they're like, that yokel on there. But I'm currently knees deep in 6 millimeter Napoleonics for a group of battles or one large battle coming up. I'll let Gary break the ground on that whole topic. But then after that, I've got plenty of figures. 10 millimeter ancients, Indians and Macedonians, 15 millimeter World War II. I've actually bought a bunch of Battlefront figures, but I'm more geared towards the battle group rule set due to the historical accuracy. I know somebody 25 years old into historicals. It's weird, isn't it?
They're not old farts out there doing historicals.
Yeah, I'm not very much into the gaming tournament type games. I'm very much into historical accuracy. I want to put my my eyes in or thoughts of the commander on that day. What was he thinking? What challenges would he have had to go through? It's for the 15 millimeters. It's going to be mostly Winter War, Finns versus Russians, because I think some of those scenarios are very interesting, off-brand scenarios that you don't really see much. Some more would be the invasion of Norway by the Germans. That's a very lesser talked about subject. But completes the combined arms of naval, air, paratroopers, and ground forces. Not too much armor. There were some small elements of German and French armor, but I think the terrain also makes a huge impact on that campaign. And that's another thing with the Winter War. That's why I'm very much into these. And then finally, it's pretty much the Operation Market Garden Forces. For anybody who's seen A Bridge Too Far, if you haven't, greatest cast of all time, definitely watch it. So that movie inspired me, and I've always wanted to create the entire group of battles or the entire operation. So that's currently in the works too.
Yeah. Some of those battlefields that we were able to go over when we lived overseas, having the routes through the areas of Market Garden when we lived in Germany and then in England, was, to me, opened my eyes, because I had been, like most young wargamers, I had always did a lot of World War II wargaming, but it was all mostly either just Russian front or Normandy type actions or that type of thing. And to really understand the level of tactical engagement and, piecing together all these little tiny fights that made up Market Garden into one big, large strategic action was a fascinating learning experience that I think I shared with you, Colin, when we were, both exploring those areas of Europe when we lived there. So it was fun. But as far as that big project, the 6mm, we decided that when we were going to do something, we're going to do something big, and we decided to start working on recreating the Battle of Leipzig in 6mm, using the old Meldrum War Games Club Blucher scenarios. And if you've never seen their site, I highly recommend it for Blucher scenarios. And I've talked to one of the guys from up there and about there, and we're going to have them hopefully have them on a future show here. But their scenarios are fantastic, and we've decided we're going to redo Blucher, redo Leipzig using Blucher, but also decided we're going to do Borodino as well, because if you got a lot of Russians for Leipzig, you might paint a few more and do Borodino. And Colin has been cranking out, probably for every one figure I do, Colin, you've been doing about 40 or 50 on the 6mm side. You've really been cranking them out fast. I've been focusing on the Austrians at this point. Did Prussian Landwehr and some of the Prussians. I've got a lot more to do. I've also been basing some French I got that were already painted from somebody else and rebasing those onto Blucher bases. We've been using the 3-inch bases from Sally Forth, which were designed for Blucher with the angled fronts and cuts, which are really a nice base. So if you play Blucher, I recommend you take a look at those as well. But that's been pretty much my activities. My major piece are working on those. I know I unfortunately suffer from the butterfly effect in wargaming, meaning I flitter from one shiny object to another. So Colin is doing a great job on trying to keep me focused on what we committed to doing, on getting that Leipzig done and those Napoleonics done. So thanks. But also, one of the things I do on the gaming is every other week I run when we're not doing in the middle of COVID-19, obviously, I run games at a local hobby shop. And since I live real close to the Marine Corps base Camp Lejeune, most of the gamers there are Marines, active duty Marines, who don't have their own figures or things like that, or they're all 40K players. So I show up have to put up both sides and bring up both sides and set up those games. So I'm always looking for games that can be done in an evening, a quick night, that don't require a lot to get into, but give a good visual effect. So I guess my short-term project is clearing everything off my table and getting everything reorganized to move forward. And long-term project, Leipzig campaign, and Leipzig battle campaign and the Borodino battle. But I think I'll get there eventually. But it makes me proud as a father to hear that the apple doesn't fall too far from the tree when you hear that your son has a lead pile that's almost as big as yours. So it's all fun, isn't it, Colin?
Thanks to you. Yeah, it is.
All right. So that's what we've been looking at. Things that are looking new and interesting, because what we want to do in this podcast is we're going to pretty much cover the same format, or we'll see how this format works out and then adjust it. So if you have if anybody listening has any comments, suggestions, etc., I will make sure there's an email added into the show notes, so you can add to, make any suggestions or comments or let us know. Conversely, if you're interested in being a guest, have a topic you'd like to talk, let us know. We'll more than happy to have you. But as far as what we'll do next is, the format's next is talk about what's we've seen new or shiny, new and shiny in the hobby, or things that are resurrecting something old. I know for me, the newest and shiniest things I've been looking at have been both from Warlord, their Age of Sail game, which they've just recently released. Then also their they have the Black Seas game, which is the Age of Sail, and then their Cruel Seas, which is World War II small boat action. Both of those I've been finding give a good quick game. Now, granted, on the Cruel Seas, I've had to do a lot of modifications to the rules to get them to feel right. But once we did that, they play very well, and give a good evenings piece out there. So those have been kind of the new things. For old things resurrecting, one thing that Colin and I have got to do, or Colin already tried it a few times, I need to try it again or bring it out, is recently got a hold of SPI's Leipzig game and the board game, and we want to try and play that. So that looks very interesting. I want to try playing that via either Portal or Skype or something like that, where we both have a board and set up long distance and play. So that's kind of one of the resurrecting something from the past that looks good to me. What about you, Colin? What have you seen that's new and shiny, or what do you want to resurrect?
New and shiny. Well, I just keep up with the miniatures page, and I'm always looking at some of the newer figures on there, what companies are producing. I've honestly been keeping my head down, keeping it very low, trying to be knees deep in my projects for the Leipzig game here.
Yeah, you're far more disciplined than I am.
Yeah. Apologies, I'm just taking care of the dog. For the old aspect, yeah, the SPI games, including some of the old board games into war games, or miniatures war games, combining them. Of course, as I said before, I'm very biased on the whole campaign aspect, as opposed to some of these newer points-based tournament games that are coming out. Of course, that's the direction that we're heading, but I very much like integrating whole thought processes behind battles, and going into the future. So you're not just keeping those troops in reserve for later in that battle. You're keeping your troops in reserve for potentially future conflicts or future battles. So say Borodino, Napoleon kept his guard in reserve, and they never really fought much, or they didn't fight at all in the battle, because he knew he needed them. He needed those big battle final victories, and he knew that guard could deliver. So he's going to keep them in reserve until he completely needs them. And I feel like if you just play that one battle, you're more likely to use that guard. You're more likely to contribute your forces when you could potentially need them elsewhere. New and shiny. Apologize, I'm circling here, but new and shiny. I have quite like the Warlord Blood Skies and the Black Sails games. Of course, they're like very fast-playing club rules that you can go there, play in one day or one evening, and potentially get a few games in. And they're very well casted miniatures. I'm loving them. My only thing is I like to play unique, different forces out there. So I've kind of built some of the ships after some Swedish ships, as opposed to the regular ships of the line. But I'm not even going to attempt to say them. I apologize to all the people of Swedish or Scandinavian nationalities. But yeah, once again, I'm just a kid from the U.S. who doesn't know too many languages. So.
Yeah, some of those galley, lantine rigged galley ships that the Swedish use on their coastal navy are really interesting looking.
Oh yeah, the archipelago fleet is just, it's different, it's unique, it's a different type of naval warfare. Because before you have ships of the line, which just of course they have their different formations, but it's mostly broadside engagement. Or this archipelago fleet, they get in close. They use those the name's passing me right now, but the little pivot guns.
Oh shoot! Why can't we remember the name?
It'll come back to me later.
We'll get it.
Of course, yeah. But yeah, they get in for very close engagements, and they're very heavily armed for that close engagement and boarding actions, and I just love bringing the steel to people.
Yeah, they are interesting, definitely. And what do you happen to remember the name of the German company that makes the Espec? It was Zibek ships and some of the lantine rigged ships for the Mediterranean that could be used with a slight modification used for Sweden. You don't have to remember the name of them, do you? The German company?
Is it Hagen Miniatures?
Hagen Miniatures, yes. If anybody's interested in that scale of warship, that 1/700 scale sailing vessel, that they use in Black Seas, look at Hagen Miniatures. They do some phenomenal ships that can easily convert to Black Seas. And their customer service, I know, and I ordered some ships from him. Excellent communication. Shipping was rather prompt. Yeah, very satisfied on the customer service side. So take a look at Hagen Miniatures. That's another one I'll make a note of to add in the show notes. So we can do that there as well. I'm just making a quick note so I don't forget to add them, because I have a memory like a steel sieve. Everything goes right through it. All right. Well, with that, and Colin, one thing you didn't mention was your Pony Wars.
Oh yes. Oh,
I think that's fascinating.
Oh yeah, it's absolutely. Well, I think this is one of those more unique conflict. Of course, some people may not think it's unique, but the what really started it is, well, right now I'm living in California, but I had to make the drive from East Coast to West Coast, and I thought, well, how many times am I going to do this? So my wife and I, we drove from Battlefield to National Park to Battlefield, and some of the battlefields out in the West I'd never seen before, like the Little Bighorn. Amazing features out here in the American West, and it's very awe-inspiring. And so I started doing some research into some of the Native American culture and some of the ways they fought war, and how it's completely different to us, and how Westerners, people from Europe and all these other countries think. Where the Americans were, or the Native Americans were very into counting coup, protecting their tribe. It's all about a warrior-based culture, kind of not exactly like, but somewhat similar to the fact where a Viking goes to Valhalla if he dies with the sword in his hand. It's a similar culture base, or like idea. Like the male is there to fight in battles. And well, I'm not saying male and only in Viking. Of course, there were female warriors, is being proven, but the Native Americans were very into self. What's a good word for it? But they're very into proving oneself as a man, and pride and honor. And of course, there were savage acts committed on both sides, but I'm not trying to get political here. But I thought it was a very interesting conflict. And it's not, neither side really understood each other quite well. And one of the rules that very well captured it was yellow ribbon. So I started painting up some 15 millimeter Native Americans, mostly. Let's see. I think I have Cheyenne. I think I have Sioux. I think I have Arapaho, and a couple other nations that I'm not thinking of right here. But I wanted to capture the different styles that these tribes have, and of course 15 millimeter probably wasn't the best for it, but to capture the different clothing, the different headdress, different painting styles that these Native Americans would have had. But yeah, I've quite gone deep into the 15 millimeter Native Americans and U.S. cavalry, and I want to get that historical side. But there's also a more movie-based rule set out there that's quite interesting and could be quite fun, especially since I grew up and watching some of these old westerns and staying up late.
Yeah, we meant to talk to you about that when you were young, but
yeah.
So, and that's the Pony Wars rules. I think Peter Berry from Bacchus Miniatures is looking to resurrect that and republish that, from what I recall reading. And I know he's been working on a 6 millimeter line to support that. We'll see what happens if that gets published out here soon to support the Pony Wars rule set. But the yellow ribbon rules, that was the one thing I thought was interesting. The way you described them is how it's, how that's conducted, and it's not all about just rolling dice and inflicting casualties. There's the hit and run tactics, etc., are played into. It sounded interesting. All right. Today's topic on the show is an introduction to the show, what we hope to achieve, why what prompted the creation of this podcast, and some future topics, and where do we want to go, what do we want to achieve. Really, what got me started on trying to get this podcast going was I started to listen to the Meeples and Miniatures podcast. Granted, I came to it rather late. I didn't really start listening to podcasts until probably last summer sometime, summer of 2019. And started following the Meeples and Miniatures, and started following Wargame Strategy, Soldiers and Strategy Magazine's podcast, and then Veteran Wargamer podcast. And started following some of those. And when Meeples and Miniatures made the decision to sign off and scale back, it prompted me to think I really liked the way they discussed the topic and had different guests on to talk about the topic and to spur conversation. Now, I never looked at Meeples and Miniatures and Veteran Wargamer and some of these other ones as competing competing podcasts, but rather as complementary podcasts. The information, and Joy of Six, God's Own Scale podcast as well was another one I started to listen to. They complement each other because they promote conversations about the hobby. They share ideas about the hobby and help develop the hobby, in my opinion. And I wanted to keep that going. I wanted to try and expand upon that to promote discussions, promote the sharing of ideas. If we're able to promote do a podcast that gets people talking, that gets people thinking about things in a different way, then fantastic. We've achieved our goal, or our initial goal. If we can get this to get more people into the hobby somehow, for instance, and that'll be a topic we're going to be talking about down the road, then even better. because as you know, our hobby is this. In my opinion, we are in the golden age of our hobby with more choices of rule sets, more choices of figures, more options available to us, and more communication among wargamers than ever before. But we're also under assault from technology. While it can also be a good thing, because technology is adding some benefits to the hobby, is around communication, around the ability to share information, share ideas, as well as helping the manufacturing process. It is impacting, and it has a tendency. It has the ability to draw people away from what we do into a more isolated type of hobby, because the thing about wargaming is there's always a social aspect to it. Even solo wargaming, there's a bit of a social aspect to it, in my opinion. But I don't know. That's kind of where I'm thinking to take this, and say, the what we really want to achieve is, promote the hobby in any way, shape, and form we can around this. Anything you want to add to that, Colin?
Yeah, well, exactly your point. Also, create just an entertaining talk show so that you, the listener, can listen into, be interested in, like entertain, pretty much.
Yeah.
Just something, whether you're driving to work, feel like listening to a podcast, we hope to be there for you. But yeah, maybe potentially give you ideas that you haven't thought of before. Maybe even you to write to that email, give us some ideas, and then we can spread the word together, or however so be, and potentially create new ideas to once again bring people to the hobby, or create new ideas on how to entertain ourselves within the hobby.
Yep. Yeah, you probably can't hear my thing, can you? Not enough rattling around in there, but I agree completely with what you've said. Now, going on to the next step, what are the things, some of the topics we're going to be talking about? We've been talking with different people to line up as guests. I don't want to mention any specific names of people who will be guests until I get release forms back from them, because thanks to GDPR regulations, and GDPR, for those in the United States who are not familiar with it, are European rules on data protection. They also apply to part of the podcast world, as well as things around copywriting names, etc. Are using people's names for promotional aspects. I can't release their names yet, so I'm not going to give any names out. But some of the topics we've been discussing with these folks are everything from talking about scale, how does scale impact your game, to how to decide what's the right scale. Well, we're talking about the impact of 3D printing on gaming. Again, there's a positive aspect for technology, but it's also could be a negative aspect for some of the manufacturers. It depends. It depends on how it's harnessed. Colin mentioned about his love of the campaign side of the game, which I agree. I love that. Also how that impacts. Again, that'll be a topic that we'll be discussing as well down the road here. We'll talk about scenario design. What's a good way to design a scenario? Do you want a scenario that is evenly based, or do you want to do you like an unbalanced game? Let's say an ambush, superior forces against minor forces. What do you look for in that? What makes a good scenario, and how do you translate a historical notes into a scenario? There's a variety of these type of topics. We're also talking about terrain. How does terrain impact your game? What is the aesthetic of your game? What do you like to see in your terrain? What do you like to see in your figures? Those type of areas. What were some of the other topics we had talked about, Colin?
Yeah, of course, how terrain impacts movement, thought process, how it ties into the visual aspect too. Other talking points will be, how do you want your rules to play into your game? Do you want the rules to be the guidebook where you're fighting the battle and they just kind of slowly push you in the right direction of how to play the battle? Or do you want the rules to dictate everything? What rules do to the game? how they impact it. What do some people like? What do they not like?
Yeah. I think that's a good point about rules too, because when I started gaming, the go-to set for World War II was a set of rules called Tractics, and Tractics was 4 books long. I think 30 charts or pages of charts. So it was quite a substantial, but everything talked about deflection of the armor, the slope of the armor, the range. It incredibly complex, and there was very little that was abstracted within it. And then you go to a set of rules like Blucher, which are abstracted. The campaign system, it's an abstraction of how troops are worn down over, through the fighting. Not actually how many troops are actually killed by volley fire, but how they're worn down. And then you have games that have complete command and control. You have some game, and I'm trying to think of a game with complete command and control, and I can't think of one off the top of my head. But then you go to games like Black Powder, or which has what I would call a variable command and control. You have a chance to not be able to move forward. To something like the rule sets that are set by Two Fat Lardies. Their rules, which are variable command, and give you the ability to, implement, the lack of command in some cases. So that fog of war that they like to talk about. So yeah, there's a lot of variations within rules, and you could have a podcast just on rules for wargaming by itself. And I don't mean a podcast; I mean just an episode. I'm talking a series. So that'll be a subject that I'm sure we're going to be coming back to. 2 things that I think we should. Well, I'm sorry. Go ahead, please.
We can also come up with how gaming space affects the game.
Yep.
Like, are you tight on storage space? Are you tight on battle space? Do you have plenty of battle space? What you can accommodate per your space set. Also, scenario design will be a future topic down the road.
Right.
We'll talk about how you can come up with scenarios, how you do your research. If you just want to do one of those games in the back of the booklet just to learn the rules, how you can spice it up, or how you can dull it down, make something easy, smooth, something that you can do in a game night, or something you can do over a weekend.
Yep. So there are all in all, there are a lot of topics there that are out there that we talked about, and anybody who's listening, we would encourage you to chime in. If there's a topic you want to hear, by all means, give us a suggestion. If there's a topic you feel really strongly about, you want to be a guest, reach out to us. By the same token, if there's somebody you think we should be talking to, let us know. I know we'll be trying to line up various folks from the hobby to talk to, but realistically, there are luminaries in our hobby who are big names everybody hears from and that. But this podcast is for the average wargamer, the people out there who want to talk about the hobby and discuss and share their viewpoint, their ideas. So we're not going to have this podcast just to the luminaries. We want to hear from everyday people as well. Because after all, that's what Colin and I are, just everyday wargamers.
Yes, quite.
Okay. Well, before we wrap up our first episode, and one thing, one thing we never talked about or never mentioned is on the format is, I am not a technical person, so I am not looking for this podcast will not be one that's going to be heavily edited or that. It's supposed to be a free-flowing conversation. So if that's the type of podcast you like, great. If you're looking for a very heavily edited, professional, new style podcast, I'm going to be a long time before I get those skills built up to deliver that. So just bear that in mind. hopefully you like free-flowing conversations. So anything else to add before we wrap up, Colin?
No, I think that sums it up. Pretty much everybody stay safe. We hope to either hear from you soon or for you to hear from us soon.
Right. Agreed. And from across the pond Wargamers to Wargamers across any pond, thanks, and thanks for listening.